All right, so we are diving into The Lean Startup by Eric Ries today.
Oh, yeah.
We've got some pretty interesting excerpts here
Mm-hmm.
and all about like navigating, the crazy world of startups. Now, I know what you might be thinking, startup methodology. It
Yeah.
doesn't sound like the most, exciting topic.
Right.
But trust me, this is not just for Silicon Valley techies. This deep dive is going to give you a fresh perspective
Right.
on problem solving and innovation that you can apply to anything you're working on.
Yeah. It's interesting because Rees really challenges the traditional idea
Mm-hmm.
of what a startup is.
Okay.
It's not just about launching the next big app or anything. He defines it as like any group of people creating something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that apply outside of the tech world? I
Yeah.
mean, you've got these like
Yeah.
iconic images of startups, right? People coding in garages fueled by pizza and venture capital.
Right, right. But Rees gives some compelling examples that break that stereotype.
Okay.
He talks about Intuit,
Mm-hmm.
the company behind TurboTax and QuickBooks, and how they applied these principles to become a financial software giant.
Wow.
And then there's this fascinating story about a volunteer initiative at HP
Okay.
that used lean startup methods to develop a successful community program.
So you're saying even established companies and volunteer groups can benefit from this startup mindset.
Yeah.
It's not just about building a business, it's about tackling any challenge
Right.
where the path forward is unclear.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the biggest challenges Rise addresses
Yeah.
is why traditional planning often fails in these uncertain environments.
Yeah.
We've all been there, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You spend weeks, maybe months, crafting the perfect plan, only to have it fall apart as soon as you hit the real world.
Oh, absolutely. I remember this one project where I thought I had every detail mapped out, and then bam, everything changed. It was like trying to build a house on quicksand.
Rees calls this achieving failure,
Oh, wow.
flawlessly executing a plan that was fundamentally flawed from the start. He argues that in these unpredictable situations, detailed plans based on assumptions can actually hinder your progress.
So how do you avoid that trap? If you can't rely on traditional planning, what do you do?
That's where Rees introduces the concept of validated learning.
Okay.
It's about shifting your focus from being right initially to constantly testing your assumptions and using the data to steer your course.
So it's not about avoiding mistakes altogether, it's about learning from them as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to illustrate this, Rees uses the story of IMVU,
Okay.
the online avatar platform.
Mm-hmm.
They started with what seemed like a brilliant plan, launching an instant messaging add-on for platforms like AIM or Yahoo Messenger.
Okay.
They figured they'd tap into the existing user base and ride the wave of popularity.
Seems logical, so what went wrong?
It was total flop. And at first they thought it was because people didn't want another IM program. But through painful observation of how customers were actually using the product, they uncovered something much deeper.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What did they discover?
It turned out that people didn't want to use avatars with their existing friends. They wanted to create new identities and make new friends in a virtual world where they could experiment and explore without the baggage of real-life relationships.
So their initial assumption about piggybacking on existing social networks was completely off base.
Exactly.
Wow.
They had to pivot away from the add-on and build a standalone network that focused on facilitating these new connections.
Interesting.
And this is a classic example of how validated learning can lead you down a path you never anticipated,
Right.
but one that's much more aligned with what customers actually want.
So they turned a failure into a valuable learning experience that ultimately led to success.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that brings us to the core of the lean startup method, the build, measure, learn cycle.
Okay.
It's about building a minimum viable product, or MVP,
Yep.
to test your core assumptions, measuring how customers respond, and then learning from that data to iterate and improve.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What exactly is a minimum viable product?
I think a lot of people get hung up on that term. They think it means creating something cheap or low quality.
Yeah, it's a common misconception. An MVP isn't about cutting corners. It's about validating your assumptions with the least amount of effort possible.
Okay.
Rees emphasizes that it should be just good enough to get feedback from real customers.
So it's like a prototype, a way to test the waters before diving in head first.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Rees provides some great examples of how companies have used MVPs to their advantage. Take Groupon, for instance.
Okay.
They didn't start with a fancy website and complex algorithms. Their MVP was literally handmade PDFs emailed to a small group of people.
Really? So they were testing the core demand for group discounts before investing heavily in technology. That's pretty scrappy.
It is. And Zappos,
Mm.
the online shoe retailer, did something similar. Their initial website was very basic, more of a test to see if people would actually buy shoes online. So they were willing to put something out there that wasn't perfect, just to get that initial feedback and validate their assumptions. That takes guts.
It does.
Yeah,
But the learning you get from these early experiments is invaluable.
right.
It helps you de-risk your assumptions and figure out what truly resonates with your audience.
This is where it gets really interesting for me, because I think a lot of people, myself included, have a tendency to get stuck in the planning phase, trying to make everything perfect before we launch. But what you're saying is sometimes it's better to just get something out there, even if it's not perfect, and learn from how people interact with it.
Absolutely. It's about embracing that iterative process, accepting that you won't have all the answers up front, and being open to course correction along the way.
That's a powerful shift in mindset. It's about embracing uncertainty rather than trying to control it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Reese provides some great examples of companies that have successfully embraced this approach. He talks about IMVU again, and how they use their MVP to validate a key assumption about customer behavior. Remember those teleporting avatars we talked about earlier?
Yeah, that definitely piqued my curiosity. It sounds a bit unconventional.
It was. They couldn't afford to create the complex technology for smooth avatar movement. So they did this hack, where avatars would just teleport from one spot to another when you clicked.
Oh, wow. So instead of delaying the launch, they embraced a temporary solution. That allowed them to test a key feature.
Exactly.
Oh.
It was a bit clunky. But it was enough to validate that people craved movement in the virtual space,
Wow.
and that learning informed their future development, showing them where to invest resources to create a better user experience.
So they turned a limitation into an opportunity for learning. That's brilliant.
It is, and it highlights a key principle of the lean startup method. Be willing to test even rough ideas, because the feedback you get is priceless.
Okay, so we've built our MVP, we're getting feedback from real customers, and we're learning as we go. But how do we measure our progress? I mean, traditional business metrics like revenue and profit might not be relevant in the early stages of a startup.
Right. That's where Rees introduces innovation accounting,
Okay.
a new way of measuring progress that focuses on learning rather than just financial performance.
So what kind of metrics should we be focusing on? What does innovation accounting look like in practice?
It's about choosing metrics that measure real progress towards a sustainable business model, not just vanity metrics that make you feel good, but don't actually reflect the underlying health of your business.
Can you give me an example? I'm sure some listeners are wondering how this plays out in the real world.
Yeah. Rees uses the example of Grokkit, an online test prep platform.
Okay.
They were initially focused on vanity metrics, like total users and questions answered. On the surface, these numbers looked great, but they weren't measuring true engagement, the kind that leads to long-term customer loyalty and sustainable growth.
So they were focusing on quantity over quality, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they shifted their focus to measuring things like user retention, how often people came back to the platform, and how much time they spent studying. They also introduced A/B testing in Kanban to rigorously test hypotheses about customer behavior and prioritize work based on real data.
Okay. I think we need to unpack those terms a bit. For those who aren't familiar, can you explain what A/B testing and Kanban are?
Absolutely. A/B testing is essentially running two versions of something simultaneously to see which one performs better. It's a classic scientific method applied to product development.
Okay.
Grokkit used this to test different features, pricing models, even the wording on their website, to see what resonated most with their users.
So they were constantly experimenting, trying to optimize every aspect of the user experience.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Kanban is a visual system for managing work, often using a board with columns representing different stages of a project. It helps teams prioritize tasks, visualize workflow, and avoid getting bogged down in things that aren't moving the needle.
So it's about creating a more transparent and efficient way of working, where everyone can see what needs to be done and what's already been accomplished.
Precisely.
Okay.
And by combining these techniques with their new focus on engagement metrics, Grokkit was able to overcome their reliance on vanity metrics and build a more sustainable business.
That's a great example of how innovation accounting can help companies shift their focus from short-term gains to long-term value creation. It's about building a business that's not just growing, but growing in a way that's sustainable and meaningful.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway for anyone, not just entrepreneurs. We all have a tendency to get caught up in vanity metrics in our own lives, whether it's likes on social media, numbers on the scale, or whatever it may be.
That's so true. I know I'm definitely guilty of that. But the lean startup approach encourages us to dig deeper, to find the metrics that truly matter and use them to guide our actions. It's about aligning our efforts with what we truly value.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about focusing on outcomes rather than just outputs.
All right, so we've built our MVP, we're measuring what matters, and we're learning from our mistakes. But what happens when things aren't working as planned? How do we know when to stick with our current course and when to change direction? I think that's a challenge a lot of people face, not just in business, but in life. When do we persevere and when do we pivot?
That's a great question. And it leads us to one of the most crucial decisions any startup faces, the pivot or persevere dilemma.
Okay.
Reezy argues that this decision shouldn't be based on gut feeling or intuition, but on data from your MVP experiments. He uses the example of Vodison, a platform for political activism, to illustrate how data-driven pivoting can lead to success.
Okay, tell me more about Vodison. How did they navigate this pivot or persevere decision?
They actually went through multiple pivots, starting as a social network for verified voters, then shifting to a paid tool for contacting elected officials, and finally landing on a self-serve platform that empowered anyone to organize and advocate for change.
So they were constantly adapting, trying to find the right product market fit. But how did they know when to pivot?
Each pivot was driven by data from their MVP experiments.
Yeah.
They were ruthlessly honest about analyzing what was working and what wasn't. They even pivoted away from a model that was generating modest revenue because they realized it wasn't scalable.
That's impressive. It takes courage to walk away from something that's sort of working.
It does. And Rees also highlights the early days of Facebook, a company that many investors were initially skeptical of because their revenue model wasn't fully developed.
But their user engagement was off the charts, right? People were spending hours on Facebook every day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And savvy investors recognized that this engagement engine was a clear signal of future growth potential, even if the revenue wasn't there yet.
So sometimes you have to look beyond the obvious metrics and trust the data that's telling you something deeper about the potential of your idea.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway from the pivot or persevere decision. Data-driven decision-making can help you overcome emotional attachment to your initial ideas and allow for course correction. It's like having a compass in the wilderness. You might have to adjust your heading, but at least you know which direction to go.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the essence of this approach. It's not about having all the answers up front. It's about being willing to adapt and change course based on what the data is telling you.
Precisely.
Okay.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore those engines of growth that can power a startup's success.
Okay.
These are the mechanisms that can propel a company from a small venture to a thriving enterprise.
Sounds fascinating. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Yeah.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about pivoting versus persevering. I'm already starting to see how these lean startup principles could apply to my own projects, but I'm also thinking about how you actually scale a startup. Once you've found that product market fit, how do you go from a small experiment to sustainable growth?
Right. That's where Rees introduces the concept of engines of growth.
Okay.
He identifies three main engines: sticky, viral, and paid. Each engine represents a different mechanism for driving customer acquisition and expansion.
Okay, I think I have a basic understanding of these terms, but can we break them down in the context of the lean startup method?
Yeah, of course. Let's start with sticky growth. This is all about creating a product or service
Yeah.
that people genuinely engage with, that becomes a habit, that they keep coming back to again and again. Think of it like that feeling you get when you discover a new podcast you can't stop listening to.
Okay, that makes sense. You want to create something so valuable that people naturally integrate it into their lives. But what about viral growth? That one always seems a bit elusive to me.
Yeah, viral growth is all about leveraging the power of word-of-mouth marketing. It's about creating a product or service that people are so excited about, that they naturally tell their friends and family. Rees uses a great example to illustrate this. Hotmail, back in the early days of email.
You're talking pre-Gmail, right? I vaguely remember those days.
Exactly. Hotmail exploded in popularity not because of fancy marketing campaigns, but because they added a simple line to their email signatures. Get your free email at Hotmail.
Ah, so every email sent became a mini advertisement. Clever.
Very clever.
Oh.
It was word-of-mouth marketing on steroids. Each new user was essentially recruiting their friends and family.
That's incredible. But what about the paid engine of growth? That seems like a more traditional approach.
Yeah, paid growth relies on advertising sales and other forms of direct marketing to acquire customers. Think of companies like Tupperware or Mary Kay. They've built entire businesses around a paid engine of growth, leveraging direct sales networks and targeted marketing campaigns.
So with these three engines of growth, sticky, viral, and paid, how do you know which one to focus on? It seems like a startup could easily spread itself too thin trying to do all three at once.
You're right, it's not about trying to master all three engines simultaneously.
Right.
Rees argues that most startups should focus on one engine initially, becoming experts in how to make it work for their specific business.
So it's about choosing the engine that aligns best with your product, your target market, and your overall business strategy.
Exactly. And each engine requires different tactics and metrics. A company focused on sticky growth will obsess over things like customer retention and repeat purchase rates. A company focused on viral growth will track how many new users each existing user brings in. And a company focused on paid growth will measure the cost of acquiring each new customer and compare it to their lifetime value.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a light bulb.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each engine and choosing the one that aligns best with your overall goals.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense, but I'm wondering how these lean startup principles apply to larger, more established companies. Can they really embrace this experimental, iterative approach?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people have. And Rees addresses it directly in The Lean Startup.
Okay.
He argues that these principles are just as relevant, if not more so, for large organizations. He uses the example of Intuit again and how they transform their QuickBooks team, which manages a mature product with millions of users.
That's interesting. QuickBooks seems about as far from a startup environment as you can get.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
But Intuit applied lean startup principles to this established product by embracing small batches, continuous feedback, and experimentation.
So they were essentially creating a startup culture within a large corporation. Did they face any resistance to this new way of working?
Changing a company's culture is never easy, especially in a large organization with established processes and hierarchies.
Right.
But Intuit's leadership was committed to this transformation, and they worked hard to create a culture that embraced experimentation and continuous learning.
So it's not just about implementing new processes. It's about shifting mindsets and creating a culture that's receptive to change.
Exactly. Rees calls this building an adaptive organization.
Okay.
It's about creating systems and structures that allow for rapid iteration, small batches, and constant feedback.
I can imagine that's a challenging process. But it sounds like the potential rewards are significant.
They are. It's about creating a company that's nimble, responsive to change, and constantly innovating, no matter what size or stage of growth it's in.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Validated learning, building MVPs, innovation accounting, pivoting versus persevering, and now engines of growth. That's a lot to take in. But I'm starting to see how these principles can be applied to so many different aspects of life, not just business.
I agree, and I think one of the most valuable takeaways from the Lean Startup is this technique called the 5 whys.
Okay.
It's a deceptively simple tool for problem solving that can be applied to any situation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about the 5 whys. How does it work?
It's all about repeatedly asking why to uncover the root cause of any problem. Instead of just addressing the symptoms, you keep digging deeper, asking why at least 5 times until you get to the underlying issue.
So it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Rees emphasizes that most problems, even technical ones, have a human element at their root. He gives an example from IMVU, where a server failure wasn't just a technical glitch. It was ultimately caused by a lack of proper training for engineers.
So instead of just fixing the server, they addressed the underlying cultural issue that led to the problem in the first place.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that's the power of the 5 whys. It helps you avoid superficial fixes and instead address systemic issues for lasting improvement.
Okay, let's walk through a hypothetical example of the 5 whys in action, just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Let's say you launch a new website and it's crashing constantly.
Great example. Let's start by asking you the obvious question. Why is the website crashing?
Okay, maybe the answer is because the server can't handle the traffic.
Good. Now we ask, why can't the server handle the traffic?
Perhaps it's because we didn't anticipate this much traffic. We underestimated demand.
Excellent. Now we dig deeper. Why didn't we anticipate this much traffic?
Well, maybe our marketing campaign was much more successful than we expected.
Okay, we're getting to the heart of it.
Yeah.
Why was our marketing campaign so successful?
Perhaps we stumbled onto a brilliant message that really resonated with our target audience. We tapped into an unmet need that no one else was addressing.
You see, what started as a technical problem has led us to a valuable insight about our business. We've uncovered a potential competitive advantage that we might not have discovered otherwise.
That's amazing. We went from troubleshooting a website crash to potentially revolutionizing our marketing strategy.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of the 5 whys.
Yeah.
It's not just about solving problems. It's about uncovering hidden opportunities and gaining a deeper understanding of your business. It forces you to ask tough questions and challenge assumptions, which can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
I love this technique. It's so simple, yet so powerful. I can see how it would be valuable not just in a business context, but in personal life as well.
Absolutely. It encourages a mindset of curiosity and critical thinking. It helps you get to the root of any issue, whether it's a technical problem, a relationship conflict, or a personal challenge you're facing.
Okay, so we've covered the core principles of the lean startup. Validated learning, build, measure, learn, MVPs, innovation accounting, pivots, engines of growth, and now the 5 whys. That's a lot to digest. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners before we move on to the last part of our deep dive?
I think the key takeaway here is that the lean startup approach isn't about having all the answers up front. It's about embracing the journey of experimentation and learning. It's about using data to guide your decisions and being willing to adapt along the way.
It's like being a scientist, constantly testing hypotheses and refining your understanding of the world.
I love that analogy. It captures the spirit of the lean startup perfectly. It's about bringing a scientific mindset to everything we do, whether we're launching a business, developing a new product, or simply trying to improve our own lives.
And that's a powerful message for anyone, no matter what kind of challenges they're facing.
Absolutely. The lean startup provides a practical framework for navigating uncertainty, for making smarter decisions, and for ultimately creating something truly valuable.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we've been exploring the lean startup, and I have to say it's really shifted my thinking about how to approach not just business ventures, but any kind of project where there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. What stands out to you? What's resonating?
Well, I used to think that planning was everything.
Right.
The more detailed the plan, the better. But now I'm seeing the value of embracing uncertainty and using data to guide my decisions. It feels more like a dynamic process of discovery rather than trying to force a specific outcome.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And it connects with the key concepts we've been discussing, the shift from focusing on outputs to focusing on outcomes.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. The lean startup encourages us to ask, are we truly making a difference? Are we creating real value? It's not just about working hard or producing a lot of stuff. It's about the impact we're having.
So it's about being intentional with our efforts and constantly evaluating whether we're moving the needle in the right direction.
Exactly. And that ties into the concept of building an adaptive organization.
Right.
Rees argues that to be successful in the long run, companies need to create a culture that embraces experimentation and learning. It's about building systems that allow for rapid iteration, small batches, and constant feedback.
I think that resonates with what you were saying earlier
Yeah.
about Intuit and how they transformed their QuickBooks team to embrace this more agile way of working.
Exactly.
They managed to shift their mindset from big, infrequent releases to a continuous cycle of experimentation and improvement. And what's impressive is they did this with a mature product, one that already had millions of users.
It sounds like they were willing to challenge the status quo, even with a product that was already successful. But I imagine that kind of cultural shift can be met with resistance, especially in large organizations. How do you get people on board with a new way of working, especially when things are already working in the traditional sense?
That's a great question. Regiers acknowledges that changing a company's culture is one of the hardest things to do.
Right.
It requires buy-in from leadership,
Yeah.
constant communication, and a willingness to challenge deeply ingrained habits and assumptions.
So it's not just about giving people new tools and processes. It's about helping them understand why this new way of working is important and how it can benefit them individually and as a team.
Absolutely. It's about empowering people to experiment, to learn from their mistakes, and to feel ownership over the results. It seems like the lean startup isn't just a set of business principles, but a philosophy for approaching any challenge. with a growth mindset and a willingness to adapt.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about embracing uncertainty, seeking constant feedback, and iterating our way towards a better future.
And that's something we can all apply, whether we're launching a business, leading a team, or simply navigating the complexities of our own lives.
Well said. I think Eric Ries would agree with that sentiment.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. What's the most important message you hope listeners will take away from the Lean Startup?
I think the most crucial takeaway is this. The lean startup approach isn't about having all the answers up front. It's about acknowledging that we don't know everything and embracing the journey of experimentation and learning. It's about using data to guide our decisions and being willing to adapt along the way.
It's about letting go of the illusion of control and embracing the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the world around us.
Exactly. And I believe that mindset can lead to greater innovation, more fulfilling work, and ultimately a more meaningful life.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the Lean Startup. I hope it's given our listeners some valuable tools and insights to apply to their own projects and endeavors.
It's been a pleasure discussing these ideas with you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep experimenting,
And keep diving deep.